So, warm welcome to this live studio broadcast of the Supply Chain Conference 2022 with the theme Reimagining the Supply Chain. Now, we've talked a lot about data transformation, sustainability. Before the break, we also looked at, how can you incorporate data transformation in your company, what tools are needed and so forth. But there is an additional leg to data, and that is how do we utilize it securely? I mean, cybersecurity might have been a buzzword a while ago, but today it's hardcore reality. And supply chain security is the part of the supply chain management that really focuses on the risk management of external suppliers, of vendors, of logistics and transportation. And its goal is really to identify, to analyze, and also mitigate the risks inherent in working with other organizations as you do in a supply chain. Now, to talk more about this, we have an expert who is going to delve into what needs to be thought about, what needs to be done, and what are the risks when it comes to data and cyber security. So I say a warm welcome up on stage to Jan Lemnitzer, who is Assistant Professor for Cybersecurity at the Department of Digitalization at the Copenhagen Business School.
Thank you for having me. Okay, can I see the presentation? Okay, so thanks for having me. Hopefully I'll see the presentation in a second. And I'm going to start by saying supply chain security is something I wasn't originally interested in, but when supply chain hacks became a thing about 2 years ago, it became something that we started thinking about systematically, and we were wondering, how do supply chain managers defend their companies from these attacks? And we did some research, and it turned out that it's actually really hard. And there's another area of research I'm interested in, and that's EU cybersecurity regulation. And there was a draft coming out from the Commission in December 2020 that for the first time said, actually, if you're critical infrastructure, then the cybersecurity of your supply chains is a legal requirement. So I was wondering, what are companies actually doing out there, and what is it they need to do in the future? So there's 3 reasons why you should be concerned about your supply chains. The first is your company is under attack. The second thing is cybersecurity of your supply chains is hard. And third, regulation might force your company to demonstrate very soon that you are up to speed on this topic or face massive fines. So I hope you're interested now. Let's start thinking about cybersecurity supply chain attacks. There was one example that got quite a lot of media notice, SolarWinds, a big hack committed by Russian state hackers, where a big cybersecurity company was used, and the automatic update system was used to actually infect tens of thousands of their clients at the same time. Second one, Kaseya, particularly here, as we are in Stockholm in Sweden, a very interesting one. An American service company was infected by criminals this time, ransomware. And they had among their customers a Norwegian financial software company that serviced the payment processing of Swedish retail chain Co-op. So that's why all 800 Co-op stores closed at the same time, because of this supply chain attack in America. Then another example, in Austria, a really small IT service provider that serviced SMEs was taken down. And because of that, all 38 customers in this part of Austria that this small company had went down with them. And in that case, I have to say, some of them went down for good because they did not recover from this attack. And it's not just IT suppliers. Also, there was in Copenhagen a big hack of a catering company that serviced big banks and other financial institutions. So when they got ransomware, also a lot of people got very scared about what level of access they had actually granted to their catering and cleaning company. So much for the attacks. now we can talk about how do you actually defend your supply chains from cyber attacks. And that's where we started to do a bit of research, and we asked supply chain managers in the leading financial and energy companies, because they're already under tight cybersecurity regulation. And we asked them, what is it you're doing? And it turns out, they start with very classic supply chain techniques, such as sending out questionnaires, asking them to fill them out. And the second big insight we had is none of them was happy this was working very well. Because for cybersecurity, you have sometimes 100, 125 questions that the companies have to fill out, and there is very little trust in the honesty or the validity of these answers. So they follow up, they schedule a meeting with these companies, they ask probing questions. And if it's a particularly high-risk supplier, then they also ask them for a site visit, and they might ask an external auditor to come in and say, okay, what is this company doing in terms of cybersecurity? Now, it's easy to see this is expensive. It's time-intensive, it takes some of your expert staff, and it costs a lot of money to take an external auditor. So this is not a reliable thing to do for hundreds of companies in your supply chain. So what do you do with them? And one of the results of our research was there's not a lot of questions being asked to these companies. So two big problems here. The first one is, how do you identify what is a high-risk supplier? And second, what are you doing about your low-risk suppliers? With the high-risk suppliers, it's a bit different than from normal supply chain techniques, because it's about access to your network. Which company has direct access to your network? How far do you grant them access? The deeper and the easier and the more automated, the more risky this company is, regardless of its size. And the other questions are, do they have access to your site physically? Might some of their employees be able to just slip in a USB stick without you noticing? These are high-risk suppliers, and you need to check them out in detail. Second, your low-risk suppliers. What can you do? You cannot send an auditor to each one of them. This would be too expensive. So there are tech solutions, because right now, the problem is that most companies have no idea about the cyber risk position of most other companies they do business with. So there is a technological solution that has been developed to fill this gap, so-called outside-in risk rating agencies. And they have been developing a technology combining what is called a vulnerability scan with data that they got from public or commercial sources. And what they offer is a score. They give you a nice, easy score. And that means you can say, okay, this company, they have a cybersecurity risk score of 500, that's bad. Let's work with this company that has a cybersecurity risk score of, say, 700, and then that's better. So these companies had their first customers in the cyber insurance industry, where to build your portfolios, you needed to make these decisions very quickly. But now they're expanding fast in network monitoring, and most recently in supply chain cyber risk monitoring, where they're positioning themselves as the solution to the problem of you know very little about the hundreds of low-risk suppliers in your supply chain. Now, I've got some bad news for you. It's not that easy. They're better than nothing. They're offering a viable technological solution. And if you see a bad rating of a company from a rating agency, it most likely means this company has a bad cybersecurity setup. The problem is, if you see a good rating, how sure can you be that you're dealing with a company that has a very good cybersecurity setup? Because the score is an outside-in snapshot. It tells us nothing about how they have configured their networks. It tells us nothing about how they're managing cybersecurity internally. It tells us nothing about whether they have a good incident response plan in place or not. Moreover, there are known ways to optimize risk rating scores. There are also companies that tell you how to set up your network so the score looks good. And I've spoken to people who have managing the score at BitSight and Security Scorecard and all the other leading companies on their job description. The bigger problem, in my view, is that they are not 100% reliable in assigning the network, the IP address of a company, and can say with certainty, this is the network of this company, and we look at how it is configured and how vulnerable it is. Because the problem is that if this allocation goes wrong, and market leader BitSight says it goes wrong in 4% of the cases. To put that into perspective, they scan 250,000 companies every second. So 4% is a lot of companies where there's clear mistakes. And so if your score is lower because a poorly configured website has been allocated to your network, who's going to find out? Either you check for it or nobody. So relying on these scores comes with certain problems. However, they are increasingly being used as the single data point when deciding whether to onboard a company in a supply chain or whether to grant them a cyber insurance policy. So even if you say, well, we're not using these products, we're not very interested, your business partners might be using these products, and your score might be something that they buy to make decisions about you, which in my view is a good reason to get interested. Let's come to the third part of the presentation, the new regulation, NIS2, the new directive that's going to be passed by the European Parliament probably next month. And it is looking at the critical infrastructure cybersecurity across the European Union. And it has a couple of very interesting features. The first is it vastly extends the scope of what is seen as critical infrastructure or essential services. Estimates are that once it is in place, about 10 times more companies are covered by these definitions. So a lot of companies that currently have no cybersecurity regulation whatsoever, they will now be in scope and face rather tough regulation. For example, food companies, food distribution companies, wastewater management, they are all clearly in scope of the new regulation. It will be passed most likely next month, and then member states will have a 21-month time limit until they have implemented into national law. And that means by the middle of 2024, this will be binding law for hundreds of thousands of companies in the EU. And one of the rules that are then binding law are to demonstrate that you have an effective cyber risk supply chain monitoring process in place. If you have not, then there are fines for the company, and there is also personal liability for risk managers who are not doing their job. So regulators can then say to a company, it's fine, you can continue employing this gentleman or this lady, they're just not allowed to make any decisions anymore. So this is something that I think should be of interest to all of you. And the problem is that if you're wondering now, okay, what is it that the EU wants me to do? We don't know exactly. We know that you have to have a supply chain monitoring process for cybersecurity in place if you are part of critical infrastructure. But what exactly the requirements are, what level, that's a bit unclear. So early drafts refer to state-of-the-art supply chain risk monitoring for cybersecurity. But they noticed themselves that this isn't very clear. So this has been replaced by a reference to international and European standards. Now, this sounds good, but you have to remember that these standards are developed for the largest companies. So in America, the NIST standard for supply chain monitoring is 326 pages long. For ISO 27001, in Austria, I happen to know, there is just under 200 companies that are certified according to this standard, but there are 400,000 companies in Austria. So by saying, yeah, just follow the standard, it's not that easy. For all the companies that are not the largest and most sophisticated, they need more guidance on what exactly it is that regulators will expect of them. And that is why I'm coming here to Stockholm from Brussels, where on Tuesday I launched a report at Microsoft's headquarters in the European quarters to reach out and urge EU policymakers to issue clear guidelines to the national regulators. Because as it stands, 27 national regulators will have to make up their own mind what is required of companies like yours. And I've been trying to persuade them that clearer guidelines are needed. And I'm urging you right now, if you suspect that your company might be part of critical infrastructure or essential services, you should talk to your board about NIS2. You should talk to your Chamber of Commerce and maybe even your national regulator about what their plans are for NIS2, because there's a couple of important questions. The first one is, to what extent you can use risk scoring system to fulfill the requirements of the regulators. If it's a no, you will have to find a way to manage a lot of questionnaires for a lot of suppliers. And also you will have to have, in any case, a clear, stringent system in place of how you are checking out the cybersecurity of your most important, your most critical high-risk suppliers. If the regulators say, well, risk rating agencies can have a role in this process, then we will see a huge expansion of these agencies' customer bases. And several issues with these rating agencies will come to the foreground. Some of them I've already spoken about. How reliable are their scores? What are they really telling us about the cybersecurity position of the companies they have scanned? But also more fundamental questions, as in, these are companies that were startups in 2010, 2011. It's a handful of them. They're all US-based. And if we fast forward 5 to 10 years, we might run into a situation where their scores decide what we do about cybersecurity and whether we onboard a company or we don't onboard a company. So it gives them enormous market power. And it is a bit like with credit rating agencies, where during the financial crisis in 2010, 2011, we here in Europe suddenly realized, wait a minute, there's 3 American companies and their scores decide whether a European company is bankrupt or not. How did that happen? We're just about to walk into a similar situation with cyber risk scoring agencies. So EU authorities should take a closer look at this industry, because after all, they are scanning your websites, your data, bundling it up into a report, running it through their own AI algorithm to create a score and selling it to your business partners. So I think this is something you should be interested in, how this is going on. And finally, coming back to the original point, why should you take this seriously? Just to sum up, your companies are under attack. Supply chain hacks are a thing. State hackers and criminals are trying to find the weakest link in your supply chain to go after the largest company they can attack, steal their data, ransom them, and encrypt their operations. Monitoring your supply chain against these threats is hard. Standard supply chain techniques don't translate very well to the world of cybersecurity. We need to think differently about this, and we need to do it now, because in just under 2 years' time, there will be very tough regulation for a lot of the companies of the supply chain managers that are currently in our audience. And they will have to face up to the reality that they will have to demonstrate to the national regulator that they have effective processes in place to monitor their supply chains for cybersecurity risks. So I think this is something that is currently overlooked, but that will be a big issue for many, many companies in the next 2 years in the run-up to the implementation of NIS2, and afterwards when the world of having to demonstrate your position to regulators to avoid fines and personal liability of managers will be the new business reality. I will continue working on these topics. If you have any questions, get in touch. If you want to read the report, I can send it to you. It was published on Tuesday. And I will continue to work on this too, because I think this and supply chain monitoring is a really important but overlooked issue. And I look forward to hearing from many of you about how you deal with this in your companies and what questions you have.
Thank you so much, Jan, and thank you for highlighting, I mean, like you say, this important issue. And I think it's also something that our viewers, I'm sure, either they've already implemented a strategy, but if they haven't, because I think many companies, you know, they're so busy with their daily operations, what would be your sort of most crucial recommendation for companies who maybe either don't have a resource internally for cybersecurity or really don't know where to start?
The first thing is really an audit of who are the outside companies with the most direct access into your system. Like if somebody is, some of your suppliers are hacked, who can directly enter your system and corrupt it, steal data, or take control. These companies you need to look at first. And then you need to think about, how am I going to look at the cybersecurity of my suppliers? Am I going to take the classical approach and start talking with them, or am I going for a technological solution, or am I combining both? What I really would advise companies is that the time to say, we're hoping for the best, is over.
Is over, okay. And would you say that it's important to have a consortium of stakeholders within the company together with someone who is sort of cybersecurity management, or what's the most optional internal way of coping with cybersecurity?
The thing here is that the supply chain managers and the cybersecurity experts in the IT team, and maybe also the data protection officers, they need to work together.
Okay.
The biggest problem we have is that people think cybersecurity is something the IT team does, and supply chain management is something the supply chain people does, and looking at data is the job of the data protection officer. They need to work together, and they need to be supervised and guided and supported by the board. So this is something that should get board level attention in this time and age.
And I really think that's a vital conclusion to convey. Do we have any audience questions?
Yes, we have one actually at this time. And this is from a person who says that he or she is from a mid-sized company. This person wonders, you might already have answered it a bit, but what is the most central thing they should start with when they want to increase their supply chain cybersecurity?
Again, look at who has direct access to your network. Who is your cloud-based IT security supplier, and what are they doing to protect themselves and protect you, for example. It was a big thing years ago to say, let's automate everything, let's work in a nice supply chain where everything just goes straight through. And it is fantastic, it is practical, and it's fast and it's convenient. But now we're in a world where cyber criminals say, thank you very much for setting this up. I'm just going to jump on this and use it against you. And that is something a mid-sized company should be aware of, because they will have 1, 2 more of these suppliers in place.
Jan Lemnitzer, thank you so much for conveying your knowledge, and I'm sure our viewers will reach out to you as this is definitely a topic that's relevant for everyone. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.